Welcome back to the Federal Executive Forum on Federal News Network. We're talking about emergency communications, and we were talking about specific programs. Nick, I want to throw it over to you and ask you to give us an example of a specific program that Verizon is working on to really further this emergency communications community.
Yeah, absolutely, Luke. So I'm going to be deferential to one of my fellow panelists here and say that I think one of the most important programs that we participate in as Verizon is the Wireless Priority Service Program with DHS CISA as lead. We've been a participatory party in that for over 10 years now, and we were the first to offer 4G LTE VoLTE. So voice over LTE services with WPS, with Wireless Priority Service. And this service is incredibly important for public safety. And we encourage the adoption of WPS services for everybody that has access to it and eligibility for it. It gives you priority access to the network for your voice calls, and you get moved up to the front of the line. And we continue to invest in supporting that program. We're very excited to continue to be partners for DHS CISA to continue to deliver priority service across the network, any spectrum band across the entire Verizon network. For all public safety. And last year we enabled interoperability with our partners over at AT&T so that those calls could go through end to end. So we're incredibly proud of WPS. But what we did recently over the last couple of years is add that into data priority as well. And so how do I take the good work that DHS CISA has done to enable WPS voice priority and enable that for data as well, because we know that data is becoming even almost as important, sometimes more important than voice in certain situations. And so enabling that with our mobile broadband priority and our private network traffic management tools to give first responders, to give public safety, both voice with WPS and data access priority to the network, wherever they are, whenever they need it. They never need to ask. It's always on, always available. That paired with preemption so that we actually remove consumers from the network when first responders need to get access on both of those systems. And I think those two really lead the way in terms of importance as per to a program for public safety.
Right, and it's really important. And any first responder needs to be assured that when they need that communications, even if the lines are over capacity, a lot of over capacity, that they're going to be able to get through. That call's going to be able to get through. I'm glad to hear that you're doing it with data too. It's almost like the lights and sirens, notion of being able to get through the traffic when you need to do that. So I'm happy to hear that. Lori, how about at the National 911 program? I'm sure there's a specific program that you'd love to highlight in regards to, furthering the mission of the entire emergency communications ecosystem.
Well, I think one of the focuses in the recent past is a renewed effort in terms of federal coordination. And that's important because when 911 was first established, there was no way for any of the 911 centers to connect to each other. The technology simply didn't enable that, but now it does. And so it becomes really important for us to be able to interconnect. So we're doing a lot of work, particularly with the federally operated 911 centers, and there are hundreds of them who have sort of been left out of the discussion, to make sure that particularly in the Department of Defense and the National Park Service, they're probably the two biggest players, to make sure that we are providing them with the tools that they need and making sure that they have the relationships with the civilian 911 centers. We've also been tapped by FEMA's COVID task force to be a point of coordination among all the 911 stakeholders for that response. And it has, I think, been invaluable not only to the federal government in terms of situational awareness, but sharing information and meeting the unmet needs that have been identified by the 911 community.
That's awesome to see that the 911 centers are now getting connected together. And for the listening audience, you're starting to see how all these major programs, it's an ecosystem where these things get stitched together to make sure that these capabilities are available when and if we need it. Chris, how about at CommSec? Can you give us Commscope? Can you give us an example of a specific program that you all have been working on, or have been working on, are working on to further this community?
Sure. I think one that we've all heard of, we've been working with the FirstNet program with our DAS systems to ensure that communications inside buildings reaches those responders. So the ability of our systems to combine both public safety, land mobile radio, and LTE services into a single system that's configurable by frequency range makes it easy to deploy, and then the scale of those systems. So a lot of companies provide single building systems, but we can spread across a campus and what I like to say reach agency campus scale under a single managed solution. So that ease of configuration and the scale of it makes it something that I always like to address with government agencies, because enterprise scale is not government scale, right? Systems need to have more reach and meet the government deployment needs for their campuses. And
Sure, and as we said, it needs to be reliable, it needs to be secure, it needs to be easy to use, it needs to be easy to configure, right? So you can implement something like that. So I'm glad to hear that. Vince, I know there's a lot of things going on at CISA. You got the WPS, you got GETS, et cetera, et cetera. Give us an example of one program that you'd like to highlight.
So thank you again. And with regards to programs to highlight, public safety communications has made considerable progress over the years in advancing interoperable communications. As you heard other panel members mention, those advancing technologies, those capabilities are obviously beneficial, but it's also introduced complexity on how you manage all those systems. So the program that we highlight over the years, and that is going to be very important to us in the future, is our technical assistance programs and how we help our public safety communicators make sense of all the technologies, putting governance around it, putting planning around it. And with regards to this technical assistance program, it's not just delivery of assistance. It's about understanding the complexities of the ecosystem. It's about looking at where those capability gaps are and developing curriculum to address those areas, such as, how do our communications units, manage information flow during an incident. But it takes all the programs that we have within within the emergency communications of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. It takes them all together and looks at things such as priority telecommunication services, which has already been mentioned. It takes into consideration our grants programs that we help our public safety communicators, get technology, get governance, get planning. It takes all those different programs that we offer, and it develops it and it puts it into a curriculum, and then we deliver it to our stakeholders. We do these programs in conjunction with our SafeCom partners, our statewide interoperability coordinator partners in each of the states and territories, and also with our federal partners as well. We've delivered over 10,000 of these technical assist engagements over the past 5 years. And again, I think the fruits of those labor were shown during the pandemic as we looked at basically mitigating communications impacts during that time frame. We had uninterrupted strategic, operational, and on-scene communications during this extended period.
Right. Is it going to be there when we need it? The answer was a resounding yes. And I'm glad to see we've got essentially a program that's making sure that all the programs run efficiently. I think that's fantastic. Jeff, how about over at Panasonic? Can you give us an example? By the way, that wasn't me that dropped the device out of the aircraft, but I'm glad to know that it survived. Yeah, give us an example of a specific program that you'd like to highlight.
Sure. So one thing we're spending a lot of time on recently is an application called ATAC. So it's an Android Tactical Assault Kit. It's been around for a while. It started out as a fairly straightforward situational awareness tool, or SA tool. So allow me to track teammates, send messages around among a team, those sorts of things. It's really been adopted widely over the last few years. It's expanded its capabilities to do things like, if I'm a deployed team, I can call in resupply over ATAC. I can call in fire support. But not just in DoD. I was actually watching a video the other day of Colorado search and rescue using ATAC to locate an injured hiker and then locate teammates. Where is everyone in relation to the hiker? So it's used in search and rescue. I've seen it used in containing wildfires. So very effective tool. And traditionally, it's been deployed to consumer grade Android devices. But I mentioned, we have a fully rugged Android handheld now. So we're doing a lot of work with the program office to deploy ATAC to those devices. And they're a little bit more functional. You can see it in direct sunlight. If you drop it, it'll be fine. It works in the rain. So that's one thing we're doing a lot of work on and see a lot of benefit from recently.
Fantastic. Must be reliable, any one of these devices. Well, we always like to talk about priorities. I'm going to ask the panel members to think about and communicate the priorities over the next 1 to 2 years. Lori, let's start with you. I know you have a lot of priorities at the 911 program, but tell us what it looks like over the next year, maybe 2 years.
Well, I think a couple of things that we're really trying to focus on are, and I think it's already been alluded to by a couple of different panel members, the importance of data. Not only the ability of first responders to access data, but also the ability of the 911 system to make decisions based on evidence. And there, frankly, has been a dearth of data available about the 911 system. So we're working with a variety of stakeholders to try and figure out what that system should look like so that they have the evidence that they need to make the important decisions that they make.
Super interesting. You're right. With all this data now, you almost have this chain of evidence, as they like to call it, right? That's going to be super important in those types of situations. Chris, how about at Commscope? What are the priorities at Commscope that you guys see over the course of the next year or two?
5G comes to play. Although our current systems for in-building wireless communications do support 5G, we see the proliferation of small cells as the spectrum moves up. The cells size is going to get smaller. The interoperability between those cells is going to range, into the millions of cell sites, right? Very, very different scenario right now than macro cells. So with that communication, we're focused on 5G, small cell, and really looking at Open RAN, open radio access networks, which is, standardizing the communications in those networks. So I look at it as, some of us were back around in the 80s, where IP networks were a lot more proprietary, and now to where they're open, interoperable. So you're going to see that same transition with the Open RAN of interoperability on that front, which is going to be necessary because the number of carriers and private LTE networks that are going to take place as you move into that 5G area is going to be necessary. So focusing on that area, and then CBRS also. So that offers a whole new spectrum in the public area that allows private networks with LTE quality to exist. So that's an area where we've kind of been first to market with some products there, and we're seeing now, in particular, like on the Air Force side, had a dominant section on requesting information on deployment with CBRS and that public band spectrum. It's free bandwidth, it's free spectrum, free bandwidth. So I expect a lot of the agencies are going to take advantage of that.
Absolutely, absolutely. As that becomes more prevalent across the community. Vince, how about at CISA? I'm sure there's a lot of priorities over there. Can you lay out sort of what the top line looks like for the next 1 or 2 years?
Sure. As you mentioned, a lot of priorities. The ecosystem's only getting more complex, and we want to make sure we have that seamless flow of information across the federal, state, local, territorial, and tribal partners and stakeholders. Probably the priorities that we're looking at really goes into alignment with what Laurie was talking about. That integration of voice, data, and video. Now that we're where we are with communications, and what we've seen over the pandemic of how useful all those mediums are. So as far as priorities, we'll look at the implementation of our National Emergency Communications Plan. That's that 5-year strategic roadmap to advance interoperability across the federal, state, local, and territorial and tribal partners in public safety. With that, when you have a good plan, another area that we're looking at is measuring that plan. How do you put in performance, adapting performance measures to make sure that we are moving the needle as it comes to emergency communications, looking at those measurements through a performance management system. I think another priority, I know another priority is, what have we learned from the pandemic response, especially the impacts the emergency communications ecosystem? We got telehealth now, telemedicine, alternate care facilities, incident response and overcoming those, congested areas with our public telecommunications services. Probably the other one that I want to highlight is working with our FEMA partners and with, again, all these are work with our public safety partners, but looking at the National Incident Management System and specifically the Incident Command System. And how do we operationalize communications within that systems? No longer is it, back when I was growing up in public safety, it's no longer just handing out a radio and making sure everybody is on the right channels. It has become this broadband, again, continued land mobile radio, IP, the whole ecosystem. So it's about operational communications now, using it at the strategic, at the command and control, and also at the on scene. How do we integrate all those? How do we make them interoperable? So our first responders and public safety will be there with the right information at the right time to save lives and property.
Sure, super important. Glad to hear. It sounds like you've got a real specific set of priorities. Jeff, how about Panasonic? Can you give us your top 2 priorities there?
Yes, sir. So one thing I was going to mention, we actually helped the Army stand up a contract out of MCOM, so Installation Management Command, last year. After the unfortunate incident on Fort Hood a few years ago, the Army basically determined that they needed to increase their posture, improve their posture. A component of that was to have more consistency across the security forces. So we actually helped the Army develop a standardized security vehicle that includes Panasonic in-car video, Toughbook laptop to do computer-aided dispatch or CAD. We got that stood up late last year. We've already started deploying that throughout the Army. That said, one of our top priorities or goals is to mod that contract into an IDIQ where we can actually leverage that, not just across DoD, but also across federal civilian agencies. So we've had CBP approach us about deploying in-fleets vehicles, the Air Force. So that's one thing we're trying to help DoD and civilian just try to have a very consistent response posture for incidents or anything else going on.
I think that's fantastic. All right, we're going to take another short break. You're listening to the Federal Executive Forum on the Federal News Network.